Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel AWS DevOps Niche 11. In this video, I'm going to touch a niche topic. So we will see how to set up Kubernetes cluster in AWS using EKS. So EKS is a managed service that is used to manage your Kubernetes clusters. That is create and manage your Kubernetes clusters. EKS is Elastic Kubernetes Service. So I'm going to give a lab demo on how can we create our Kubernetes cluster using the EKS. So as I highlighted in my previous video on Kubernetes, these are all the various ways how you can set up the Kubernetes cluster. So if at all you want to set up a learning environment, you can use Minikube or Kind. And if you want to go for a production setup, we can use KubeADM, we can use Kops, or we can use KubeSpray. And if you want to set up the Kubernetes cluster as a managed service within the cloud, then we have Azure Kubernetes Service for Azure Cloud. Then we have EKS for AWS Cloud. And we have Google Kubernetes Engine for the Google Cloud. So in this video, we are going to see how to create a Kubernetes cluster using EKS in AWS. So let us get into the lab demo. So these will be our steps on how to implement this cluster in EKS. First is we will go ahead and launch an EC2 instance, which I'm calling it as a EKS bootstrap. Okay, so it will be a EC2 Linux instance, and from this instance we are going to create a cluster. Then we will install the AWS CLI latest version, which is the prerequisite. Then we will set up the latest version of kubectl. We will set up the latest version of eksctl. So eksctl is the command line interface with which you can talk to the Kubernetes cluster in EKS. Then we need an IAM role with the needed permissions, which we need to attach it to the EKS bootstrap instance. Then we will create the cluster, we will validate the cluster, and we will delete the cluster. So this will be our step-by-step instructions to create the Kubernetes cluster in EKS. Now let us go ahead into the lab. The first step is launching an EC2 instance, which is the EKS bootstrap. So let me go back to my AWS console, and I'm in the EC2 dashboard here. So let me click instances. I'll click launch instances. So I will name this as EKS bootstrap. And in the AMIs, I'm just going to change it to the Amazon Linux 2. That should be sufficient. T2.micro, that is fine. I'm going to select my existing key pair. And with respect to the security group, I'm going to allow only SSH just from my IP address. And let us go ahead and launch the instance. Okay, it is in the pending state. It should shortly coming into the running state. Okay, so the instance is in the running state. Let us go ahead and log into this instance. I'll grab the public IP. I'll open the key. And let me select my private key. Okay, now we have logged into the Linux instance, which is the EKS bootstrap. So from here, we will execute the commands to create the cluster one by one. So let me go to my instructions here. So first is launching an EC2 instance. So this is done. So the next step is installing the AWS CLI latest version, right? So for that, let us go into this link and we will download and install the latest version of the AWS CLI. Okay, so I'll click AWS CLI install and update instructions. And let me go into the Linux section. And you can see here we have some instructions for Linux x86 64-bit. This is what we want. So let me just copy this and I will put it here in the instance. Okay, sudo AWS install. I'll say enter. Okay, fine. So AWS CLI latest version has been installed. Now let us take a look at the version of the AWS CLI. Okay, you can see here it is CLI 2.12.7 with Python 3.11.4. Okay, so this is our first step to install the AWS CLI. Now, what is our next step? Set up the Kubectl. So we need to download the latest version of the Kubectl. So which I'm going to do it from this particular link. Let me copy the link. Okay, so I'll click this section. Install kubectl binary with curl on Linux. And we have the step for x86 64. I'm going to copy this. So this is for the latest version. But if you see the note here, if you want to download a specific version of kubectl, so you will have to replace this particular section with the actual version number that you want to download, right? So dl.kubernetes.io/release/ instead of stable.txt, you need to mention the actual version of kubectl that you would like to download. Okay, if at all you want to go for a latest version. But if you want to install the latest version of kubectl, or sorry, if at all you want to go for some older versions of the kubectl, you can replace the staple.txt with a particular version number. Or if you want to go ahead with the latest version of kubectl, you can straight away copy this command. So I will copy this command. Enter. Okay, so kubectl has been downloaded. Now let us go ahead and give execute permissions. So I will say chmod plus x. So chmod plus kubectl. Okay, so I have given execute permissions to this kubectl binary, and then we'll have to move the binary into the user local bin. So I will say mv kubectl /usr/local/bin. So this is also done. So let's verify if our kubectl installation is successful. If I just give the command kubectl, I'm getting all the flags that need to be used with the command. So we are done with the kubectl setup. Now what is our next step? We have to set up the EKS which I mentioned before. It is a command line interface to interact with the Kubernetes cluster in EKS. So now let us go ahead and download the latest release of EKS. So this is a command. So let me copy this command. So it is available in the GitHub repository. Okay, now we have installed it and we have even moved the binaries to the USR local bin. Now let us check what is the version of eksctl. Okay, it is 0.147.0. Okay, so that is a version of eksctl that we are running. Let me also check what is the version of kubectl. Okay, so it is version 1.27.3. Okay, fine. So we are done till the setup of the eksctl. What is our next step? It is a creation of IAM role. And even if I go back to my instructions here, so we are done with setup of the EC2 instance. We have installed the AWS CLI. We have set up the kubectl. We have set up the EKS Now we have to create the IAM role and attach it to the bootstrap instance so that this instance will have necessary permissions in order to create a cluster in AWS. So let us see what are all the permissions that we need to map it to the IAM role. So these are all the permissions. So we need to have IAM full access, EC2 full access, VPC full access, CloudFormation full access. Also, we need to attach one custom policy also, right? So which is having this permission of EKS : all the actions pertaining to the EKS cluster, we need to map that permission also as part of our role. So now let me go ahead and create this IAM role in the AWS console. So here, let me search for IAM. And I'll click roles. Okay, so what are all the permissions we need to map? First is IAM full access. So I will search for IAM full access. Sorry, I will first say create role. Okay, so it is a AWS service. And to which resource we are going to assign this role? It is going to be assigned to the EC2 instance. So I'm going to select EC2 here. Click next. Now we need to map the permissions. So our first permission is IAM full access. So let me copy this IAM full access. I'm going to search for it here. Okay, here it is. So let me select it. And I'm going to search for the next role, next permission, which is EC2 full access. So EC2 full access, I'll select that. The third permission is VPC full access. Okay, VPC full access. And the next one is CloudFormation full access. Okay, here it is. So now we have mapped all these 4 permissions to this role. I'll give it a name as EKS. Okay, so this role will give all the necessary permissions for our EKS bootstrap instance to launch the cluster in AWS. Now let me go ahead and click create role. Okay, now you can see that the role has been created, but this is not sufficient. As I mentioned before, you need to attach one custom policy also in which the action EKS : is defined. So how do we create this custom policy? I will click policies here and I will say create policy. And I will click JSON because policy will be generally in the JSON format. So what I will do is I'm going to directly copy this snippet, which is having the custom code, and I'm pasting it here. And I will say next. Okay, and let me give the name for this policy as EKS custom. Let us go ahead and create this policy. Right, now this policy is also created. Now what we need to do, we have to go back to our role and attach this policy also along with those 4 permissions. I will search for EKS role. Now you can see here, these are all the 4 permissions that we have mapped to this particular role. Now we need to add the policy also. I will say add permissions, attach policies, and which is our policy name, the custom policy name, it is EKS custom. So I'm going to select that and I will click add permission. Now you will see that this role is assigned with all the needed permissions. These are all the standard permissions. This is one custom policy what we have assigned to this role. Right. So we are done with our next step also in terms of creating an IAM role, but we have not still assigned this role to our EC2 instance, right? So that is our next step. We need to assign this role to our EKS bootstrap instance. So how do I do that? Select this instance, go to actions, security, modify IAM role, and here you select this EKS role, the one that we created, and just say update IAM role. Now we have assigned this role to the EC2 instance. So I think now with this, we are done with all the prerequisites before we create our cluster in EKS. Now, let us go ahead and create our cluster. So this is a command, eksctl create cluster -- name. This is your cluster name. Then we have to define the region where we are hosting the cluster and what should be the type of the node within the cluster. What should be the type of instance? Should it be a t2.small or should it be a t2.micro? So this depending on the type of workloads that you are going to run in your Kubernetes cluster, you have to select the instance type accordingly. But for our lab purpose here, I'm going to just use this command. Let me copy this. eksctl create cluster -- name. I'm naming the cluster as test-cluster and the region is US West 2. Maybe I will launch it in the North Virginia itself. So I'm going to change the region name as US-East-1, which is for North Virginia. And the node type, the instance type I'm selecting is t2.small. Enter. Now you can see that it has started creating the cluster. So if at all we had any permission issues, we would have got the error now itself, but now it is telling that it is basically deploying the stack. So what it will do is, this command is going to create a stack in CloudFormation. So it is going to create a stack in the CloudFormation, and that stack creation will involve creation of all the needed components for your Kubernetes cluster. So that involves your EC2 instances, auto-scaling groups, some Route 53 hosted zones, etc. Everything will be managed end-to-end by the EKS itself. Okay, so this is going to take some time, maybe 15 to 20 minutes. So I'm going to pause the video for some time, and once the cluster is online, we can continue further. Hi everyone, welcome back. So the cluster has got created. You can see this message, this EKS cluster test-cluster in the US-East- region is ready. Okay, so now our cluster is created. As I mentioned before, this cluster is actually created via the CloudFormation stack. Okay, so if you see here, I'm in the CloudFormation dashboard. It has basically created two stacks here. Okay, and if I check this stack for eksctl test cluster, now you can see that these are all the various resources it has created. There is a shared node security group. There is a control plane. All the associated security groups. We have an internet gateway, NAT IP, all the needed subnets, CloudWatch metrics, the permissions for the ELB. So there are so many components that got created as part of the cluster creation through this CloudFormation stack. And if I go back again, if I click the first stack, here also you can see that there is a launch template, there is a managed node group, there is a node instance role. So many components got created. So now we will validate our cluster. So this is a command to validate the cluster. So I just say eksctl get cluster Okay, I think we need to give the region name also. So get cluster minus region US hyphen east hyphen 1. So you can see here, this is a cluster that is available in the North Virginia region. And we can also give the command kubectl get nodes in order to see what are all the nodes or the instances that is running as part of the cluster. So you can see that we have 2 instances that is running, which is running the version 1.25.9. This is part of the the Kubernetes cluster created as part of EKS. Okay, so we can also check that the instance dashboard as well. So if I go to my EC2 dashboard, you can see here, these are all the 2 nodes that is part of the EKS Kubernetes cluster. Okay, so now whatever deployments that we will create, they will be created on any of these nodes. Okay, now we will see how to create a deployment and a service using this EKS cluster and how to access that application via the cluster, right? So now this is a command I'm going to use. I'm going to create a Tomcat application on our EKS cluster by creating a deployment. So by creating deployment, we can create the pods as well automatically. So let me use this command to create a deployment. So kubectl create deployment. My deployment name is tomcat-deployment. Okay, and the image, what will be downloaded from the Docker Hub, it will be tomcat:8.0. Okay, so now I'll say enter. You can see that it has created the deployment with the name tomcat-deployment. We can verify it with the command kubectl get deploy. You can see that it is saying 0/1 is ready. So it is still spinning up the deployment. Now it is ready. Now, creation of the deployment will automatically create the pods as well. So we can check what pod it has created. So kubectl get pod. You can see here, this is a pod that it has created. And there is one pod which is running one Tomcat container. Okay. So we can also see some additional information about the pod. Kubectl get pod -o while. You can see here, this is the pod IP address. And this is the pod name. Now, how do we access this Tomcat application from the outside world? So we saw various service types. So first and foremost, we need to create a service. And we need to configure a service type also. The service type can be a cluster IP. It can be a load balancer. It can be an external name. There are multiple types, which we saw in my last video. So in this lab, I'm going to create a service type as a load balancer in order to expose our Tomcat application running on the EKS cluster. So let me expose our deployment as a service. So this is a command, kubectl expose deployment, the deployment name, the port will be 8080 because that is a default port for the Tomcat application. And what is the service type? It is load balancer. So I'm going to access this Tomcat application via the load balancer, or any external user, whoever wants to access the Tomcat application running on the EKS cluster, he will be able to access it via the load balancer. Okay, so this is my command to expose my deployment as a service via the load balancer. You can see here it is saying service Tomcat-deployment exposed. So kubectl get service -o while in order to look into the details of that service. So there is a default cluster IP address. And this is the load balancer that it has pinned up. As you can see here, for the Tomcat deployment, this is the IP address of the load balancer, and this is the load balancer endpoint. So if we want to access the Tomcat application, we need to give this load balancer endpoint in the browser, and we need to use the port 8080, because that is a port we have defined here also. When we expose the deployment, we have mentioned the port as 8080. So we can access the application using the load balancer on port 8080. Okay, so let us verify it. So let me go to my AWS console, and we can also go to the load balancers to see whether this load balancer is successfully provisioned. You can see here, this is the load balancer 1EF6, 1EF6, right? And let me see whether the instances on this load balancer are in the healthy state. If I click instances, okay, you can see here, both the instances are in service state. So we should be good. The load balancer is healthy now. Now let us try to access the Tomcat application from this load balancer. So how do I do that? Just let me grab the DNS name of the load balancer, and I will put it here. I will say :8080, because that is a port on which we can access the Tomcat application. So load balancer endpoint : the port 8080, enter. Can you see here? Now we can access the Tomcat application, which is running on the EKS cluster, right? So we created the service type as a load balancer. We entered the load balancer endpoint in the browser, and we gave the port that is : 8080 to access our Tomcat application. Okay. So I hope this is clear, how to create an EKS cluster, how to create a deployment in the EKS cluster, how to expose the deployment as a service using load balancer as a service type. So that's all I had pretty much on this video. So now we will see the command how to delete the cluster. So it's important that you delete your cluster also once you create it, because it is going to take up a lot of resources and you might be charged as well. So once you have done your testing, checked your access of the application, etc., it's better to delete the cluster immediately. This is a command to delete the cluster. You can say eksctl delete cluster, the cluster name. So in my case, it is test-cluster, and you can also give the region name --region US-East-1. That's it. So this command will delete your cluster, and before that, it will also delete the deployments and services whatever you created. So in our case, we created a Tomcat deployment. We also created a service using load balancer as a service type. So first it will clean all those, and then it will delete the cluster as well. I hope this video was helpful. So if at all you like this video, please press the like button. And if at all you want to share it with your known circles, please feel free to share this video. So thank you so much, everyone. And I will meet you all in my next video.